Service members of Reddit, what is your worst military wife story? Story number 1. Oh boy, buckle up. This happened throughout 3 months deployments over 2 years. First deployment, I came back to my wife in a big stack of mail. In them were 2 notices of repossession for non-payment of my car, 3 final notices for all of our utilities, and a letter from the landlord. I started with the car since I didn't want it to be repossessed. I went to our joint bank account and found it empty. No bills had been paid in 3 months. When I asked her about what happened to all of her money, she said, "I went to Waffle House a lot." Second deployment, I came back to a house with 4 dogs and 3 cats. There was the outside garbage can sitting in the middle of the living room. Oh, and a homeless guy was sleeping on my couch. She had taken to volunteering at the local animal shelter and had to save all these animals from being euthanized. The backyard had no grass left from the dogs digging, the carpets were torn up from the feral cats, and there were piles of dog shit, petrified, all over the house. When asked about the garbage can, she said that it was just too hard to take the trash out. When asked about the homeless guy, she said that she had met him at Waffle House and he just needed some help. On the third deployment, I came back to my wife having made 2 new friends. After pailing around with them for a couple of months, a different girl friend told me that my wife had been cheating on me with these 2 guys. When I asked about the cheating, she said she only sucked his dick because it was Christmas and she hadn't gotten him a gift. Wait. At no point did it say that you've divorced this woman, and I find that concerning. Story 2. I have 2. First, I was the witness to one of my soldiers' wedding. It was a typical Joe wedding and that took place midday at a Wings and Things during the Lucky Bride's lunch break. The mother of the bride owned said Wings and Things but refused to attend the ceremony despite being at work that day. It was pretty amazing. Second, I was at officer candidate school with an army hot blonde. She was a deployment 9 out of 10 and everybody hit on her. She was drowning in attention, but it was all for naught because she was married to a Green Beret or something. Well, all that attention finally got to her and she started sleeping with the cadets. It got to the point of her and another married female getting nailed in a hotel room at the same time, and they reportedly high-fived mid-coitus. About 3/4 of the way through the course, she started to put on a little weight, and it sure seemed like her belly was growing faster than the rest of her. But 4 weeks before graduation, it came out that she was, in fact, pregnant with who the f*** knows baby. Not long after graduation, I heard that her marriage to Mr. Special Force did not survive the encounter. Story 3. My brother-in-law was on both sides of shitty cheating stories. He married a woman he chatted with online for a few weeks when he was 19. Then he had to go to Iraq. A month after he left, she told him that he got her pregnant. He comes home after 6 months, then she has the baby. The baby is not his. Fast forward 10 years later. He's married to an awesome chick we all like. She works a job and takes care of everything around the house. He cheats on her with an 18-year-old that worked at Sonic. She catches him and leaves for a weekend to go stay with her sister to figure out what to do. He puts all her stuff in cardboard boxes out under the carport and moves in the new girl. Wow, he really is a piece of shit. Story 4. A buddy of mine I met in ET school had met a younger Mexican girl, fell in love, and wanted to provide a better life for her than he was able to at that time. He had been in the Coast Guard and rejoined, had the first pick of where he was going to be stationed next, because he'd already had prior service and had been on a ship for years. The school was about 5 months long. While he was there, his wife decided to join too without telling him. They were from South Texas and he had the choice to be stationed in Galveston, not far from both of their families. But she ends up getting stationed in Oregon on land. The closest place they could get him to where she was stationed was Seattle, also on land, but he obviously wanted to be close to her, so that's where he opted to choose. However, within a couple of weeks of graduation, she also gets transferred to Seattle, so it looks like things might be okay after all. Until the day of graduation when they tell him they have changed his orders and he'll be stationed on a polar icebreaker, which would be leaving the week he gets to his new unit. The ship was set to literally make a trip around the world and he'd be gone for 7 months or so. He finds out while off the southern coast of South America that she has been kicked out of the Coast Guard for drugs and for cheating with a guy she was stationed with. Another long story. And he was now working as a stripper in Seattle. Were there red flags before they got married? I'm not sure, but it didn't seem that way before she joined the CG. Who was a nice and really good dude. Great turn of events in such a short time. Story 5. I was in the officer club in Okinawa around 2012 or so. I walk at least 6 women in slutty, cut-off shorts versions of flight suits that were bright orange. I was pretty confused until my Marine friend told me that meant their husbands were deployed and they were looking for a good time. Apparently it was an open secret. While I was in the Air Force way back in 2003 or so, a guy's wife started hanging out in the dorms without her husband. I and my buddy avoided her because we figured it wasn't going to turn out okay. Yeah, Turns out she was just running through every guy in the dorm and even had sex with a guy in our shop. I mean that literally. He brought her into the shop and they had sex on one of our workbenches. Again, back in the early 2000s, a guy I know had his wife attack him with an iron skillet. Both of them were on active duty. He ended up choking her out because she was trying to kill him. Cops get called because it's base housing and the walls are paper thin. His wife admits she attacked him and he was just defending himself. First sergeant presses charges on the husband. The husband gets found guilty and kicked out of the Air Force and becomes a house husband for his wife, who's still in the military. His wife never got charged with anything. Story 6. A dude in my platoon's wife falsely accused her ex-military personnel boyfriend of rape. Went as far as stabbing a mattress and swallowing a condom to set him up. The dude spent weeks in jail before being cleared of all charges. When it comes to light, it was the crazy lady's vindictive bullshit that amped up the crazy. She handed her friend her and my platoon mate's baby through a window at night while they watched a movie. The platoon mate went to check on the baby and it was missing. Prompted the first Amber Alert in Alaska's history. She tried to pin it on the military personnel as some sort of act of vengeance. I can only imagine what the poor dude was thinking when the cops came to him with this. He very quickly eliminated the subject and they figured out that the baby was safe rather quickly. Story 7. Okay, back in 2004. I am deployed to Iraq. I get a FedEx box. My wife of 8 years, who was in the Navy, had sent me a note that read, "Your dog died," paper clipped to a picture of my 7-year-old Queensland healer. Under that photo were our divorce papers signed and filled without my presence or knowledge. She had full power of attorney. I came home after 18 months away, yay stop loss, to a storage shed that had been picked over by relatives and about $12,000 in savings. Should have been closer to $80K, but she took her half. She apparently fell in love while out on a cruise and decided that it was in her best interest to just cut strings and move out. So she did move, and put a 3-bedroom home into a 10x10 U-Haul storage unit that was on my credit card for over a year. The value of those contents? About $500 in furniture. Yeah, being married while in the service was great. Story 8. On my first deployment, we had a comm guy that was dumber than a bag of hammers. His wife wasn't much brighter. We didn't have any steady communication back home, so the days we had phones or internet access were always a big deal. Well, one of those phone days he came in all excited, saying that his wife told him she was 3 months pregnant, and 4 months into the deployment. He did his rounds of telling everyone all excited, and I didn't think anyone had the heart to tell him to think about the math. We get back from deployment, and when his son was born, he came out looking a little different than what everyone expected. His wife was Mexican, so I guess that was enough to convince him that everything was okay. Story 9. I got 2. We had a particularly worthless piece of shit in my unit. Let's call him Warren for sake of the story. Warren was the single stupidest SOB, Special Operations Battalion, I've ever met in my entire life. Bar none. Absolute shit Marine who could legitimately barely tie his shoes. The fact that this dude had passed through the recruiters, boot camp, and SOI, Signal Operating Instructions, was a pox in the name of the Marine Corps in my opinion. This dude got married before we left for our first tour. It took her about 3 days to send him pictures of her getting a train run on her by 6 black dudes. He and his wife were both pale white. Not trying to make it racist, just setting the scene. She proceeded to get knocked up during one of these trysts, which she was holding at their base housing regularly. She found out which one of the dudes was the father and had him move into their house. When we returned from deployment, he proceeded to forgive her and continued to let her baby daddy live in the house with him. That went on for a couple of months till the dude beat him up and they called PMO, Provost Marshal Office, to get him out of there. Fast forward a few years, I'm awaiting separation because I reached the end of my contract, and so is Warren because we went to boot camp together. He made it all the way somehow. We were living in a barracks designated for soon-to-be separating Marines. We would hang out and bump ears of people to get drunk, while she would make her way from room to room looking for dick with a decent success rate. That was the state of things when I packed up my shit and left. She offered me a goodbye BJ, which I politely declined. The other dude was also a piece of shit. We will call him Niles. He was one of our junior Marines and was worthless from day one. The dude smoked a pack a day and never passed an annual fitness test as far as I know. Physically and mentally weak. Lived in off-base housing with his wife. The story we got was that his lady was puking in the toilet drunk when he proposed to her in between volleys and she said yes and went through with it. This dude would have some of the platoons over to his apartment on the weekends to do some drinking and hanging out. I never went. Mostly because I was very hard on him during the workday, being as how I was this chucklefuck team leader. The story I heard from multiple sources was that every party went pretty much the same way. They would all start drinking, Niles would get wasted way early because he was a lightweight, pass out, and then his wife would pick 1 to 3 other guys there and let them have their way with her, in the other room while he drunkenly slept the night away. You get only the classiest of people in the Marine Infantry. Story 10. Obligatory, not me, but my friend who I'll call Robert. Robert was a bummy, slobby-looking guy who was always on the receiving end of jokes and pretty much only survived because he was a nice guy. So as lazy as he was, most airmen would cover for him. Being a genuinely nice guy goes a long way in the military. So Robert had an unusually hot wife, which completely surprised everyone that ever saw them together. And we all assumed that he was packing some real heat or that he wasn't a shallow asshole like the rest of us. So I'm not sure how this was arranged, but Robert had a best friend who I'll call Greg. One day after a few beers, Robert decides it would be really cool if Greg fucked his wife and let him watch. Greg is objectively a better looking guy, by the way, and it happens. Greg fucks the wife while Robert watches. This happens a few more times until one of the times, the wife finishes up with Greg and tells her husband, Robert, that she no longer wants to fuck him, that she only wants to fuck Greg. This made him very upset. Why do I know all of this? Because Robert came into our squadron and had a mental breakdown and told all of us. I was there trying to get some leave paperwork signed. He straight up told this entire story to all of our leadership and finished it off with a demand that Greg is punished. Greg obviously wasn't punished, but was asked to stop, which I'm sure he didn't. No one was punished, and in classic military fashion, this story spread faster than his wife's legs for Greg. Gossip runs hard in the military. Story 11. I once pulled over the same lady on 3 separate occasions for speeding in a school zone. I was trying to be nice the first 2 times, let her off the hook, but she started bawling the 3rd time, and I lost my patience. She kept sobbing, saying her husband was deployed. I let her keep doing this for a couple of minutes while I was writing everything she said in my notes. It felt like a hot fuzz moment. I finally asked her how her husband being deployed was relevant to her speeding in a school zone, and then she just stared at me, like she couldn't believe I would question it. She got quiet afterward and I handed her the ticket and walked away without saying anything else. Story 12. Well, I was in the Navy, my husband was a civilian, but we married young like all service members do at 19. We grew up in the same city and dated for several years. I thought I knew the guy inside and out. He had some anger issues, but nothing out of the ordinary for a 19-year-old dude. I deployed to Afghanistan almost immediately, and that's when things changed. Some other base wife told him that I was fucking dudes in porta potties, which I was not. He started doing heroin at some point, started selling drugs to base wives, and absolutely trashed my house. He sold everything and drained my account. Thousands of dollars in deployment money gone. He left base never to return. My 2 dogs were left in the house, did more and more damage, and were taken to the Humane Society where I paid hundreds to get them back. He hung out with a Japanese girl off base until my return. They got pregnant. Then he started to follow me and threaten me. Anyways, we got divorced and the psycho mother continued to threaten me for several years. Overall, very fun experience. Would rate it 4 out of 10. Story 13. I was in with a guy that proposed to a girl back home that he barely knew. He bought her a car that she complained about but still accepted. He doesn't even have a car and asks for rides everywhere. He got her an apartment back in their hometown and pays her rent. He sends her his entire paycheck to her to help her take care of her son and get everything else she needs. He would tell me fishy things about her that made it obvious she was cheating. Out of nowhere, she gets pregnant and stops talking to him completely. I tell him to get a DNA and he refused. Of course, a couple of months later, the baby is born and looks nothing like him. He gets the test and it's not his daughter. He later found out the baby was by the first kid's basketball coach. The coach tells my friend, he's a good father and I'm gonna fall back and let you raise her. My friend is still with her to this day and she refuses to marry him. Story 14. Happened in 2004 when we got back from the Iraq invasion and such. We had just hit Bangor, Maine, and some vets had cell phones that were donated for us to call and tell our loved ones that we were just hours from the reunion. The sergeant called his wife. The whole deployment has no issues and all is good. Or so he thought. We hear a string of cursing as only an infantryman could, and this cell goes flying like a scud across the terminal. So apparently she decided to wait until he was just a few hours from home after a year of combat to say she was divorcing him. She had left him negative a few hundred in the bank account. What she didn't throw out was now in a couple of trash bags in his truck. Shitty old beater. Unsecured and unlocked in the barracks parking lot. He was remarried within 2 months. There were no classy winners or losers in this story. No animals were harmed and no coat hangers were bloodied. Story 15. My best mate in the army married a girl he just met, and then deployed. While he was gone, she kept begging him for money to buy everything that they needed to set up the house when he got back. When his tour ended, the girl was genuinely pissed and wanted to know how soon he was deploying again. After some days of heated discussion, it turned out that she expected he would die in combat, and told him that she, her family, and her boyfriend were counting on the money. It was an aircraft deck and never left the airport. He threw her out and told her they were getting divorced, and she offered up her sister as a replacement. Story 16. I was stationed at Fort Knox in the late 80s. A soldier's child turned up missing. Damn nearly every soldier on Fort Knox was looking for this kid. We looked for days. This kid never turns up. I leave and move on. Several years later, I'm sent back to Fort Knox. Out of the blue, a bunch of activities happening at a park several miles away. The little girl turned up, some of her anyway, and it turns out that the soldier's wife, the girl's stepmom, killed the girl. The soldier came home, found out, and hid the body in the park. The whole case was solved because the older sister of the girl was starting to get worried she was next, told the teacher who got the police involved. That is the worst I've heard of. Over 20 plus years in the army. Plenty of cheating and plenty of other stuff. You find out that your wife murdered your fucking child and you cover for her? There are no words. Story 17. I am a military spouse but worked as a Department of Defense employee with the Marines. Got a call that a military spouse was in the hospital, her place on base housing had gone broken into, and the 9-month pregnant spouse was raped and beaten and taken by ambulance to the hospital. The assault caused a miscarriage. I was devastated. I went to the hospital with several officers and Marines chains of command. One of the nurses tending her looked me in the eye and said, "I am very interested in how this is going to play out." I was so confused. The 9-month pregnant rape and assault victim was given an ultrasound and blood work performed upon being admitted to the hospital. She hadn't been pregnant. She wasn't raped. Her due date was the next day and she's been faking the pregnancy the whole time. She beat herself up and carved herself up with a knife, then made up the rape story resulting in miscarriage, as a way to cover up the 9 months of lying to her husband about being pregnant. I've never seen this level of crazy until 3 months later when said Marine reunited with a batshit crazy girl even after all that. Not sure what makes these women so batshit crazy.
Drill instructors or drill sergeants of Reddit. What's the funniest thing you've seen a recruiter do that you couldn't laugh at? Story 1. In my basic training class, I was a squad leader, which is essentially just a person who does extra chores. Anyway, for reasons unknown, I and the other squad leaders were doing push-ups in the drill sergeant's office. Now, when you do these push-ups, you'll eventually reach muscle failure, so you sort of just hang there in the front leaning rest and try to bust out another push-up every few seconds or so. We're all dying in there, and the drill sergeant says to one of my buddies, "Private Hudson, tell me what's the difference between basic training and being in prison?" Without missing a beat, Private Hudson says, "Drill sergeant, in prison they get to watch TV." The drill sergeant cracked a little bit of a smile and then told us to get up and out of there. Nothing like some extreme physical workout to get your brain frying. Story 2. Boot Camp MCRD San Diego. Had a kid with glasses, very young. Did not look like Marine material. He kept glancing up at airplanes overhead during the drill. Drill instructor noticed and asked him what he was looking at. The kid replies, "Airplanes, drill instructor." DI says, "Those planes are trying to invade and only you can stop them. I want to hear your war cry at every plane until it leaves this depot." The remainder of Phase 1 of boot camp consisted of this kid screaming at every plane overhead. Hilarity ensued. Story 3. Had a soldier one time stop doing mountain climbers while we were being smoked as a platoon. Drill sergeant came up and squatted down, yelling in his face why he stopped. Recruit yelled back, "This soldier has made it to the top of the mountain, drill sergeant." Dude just walked away, trying not to break with laughter. Story 4. In Navy boot camp, they call forced physical trainings beatings. Everyone knows what a beating is. The Navy doesn't have drill instructors, they call them RDCs, Recruit Division Commanders. One day, standing in the ranks, the RDC is going around asking random trivia questions about a test we had to take to make sure we had all been studying. He gets to be an eccentric guy to say the least. This is about a month and a half into boot camp. RDC asks a question. The guy gets it wrong, so RDC yells, "No, wrong, beat yourself." Literally everyone knew this meant to start doing push-ups, so the expectation is he'll start doing push-ups as the RDC moves to the next guy to ask a question. I was standing across from the guy, and he had a confused look on his face. He looked at his own hand for like 5 seconds and then hauled off and slapped himself in the face. It made a loud crack sound. He got himself good. I cracked and chuckled, trying to keep my composure at attention. The RDC looked at me and then realized why I laughed had to do with the slapping sound. He turned back to the self-slapping guy and asked him if he slapped himself. The guy said, "You told me to beat myself." Cue the entire barracks cracking up. It was a single moment during boot camp where the curtain was raised and a moment of unadulterated levity came over everyone. The RDC couldn't stop laughing, so the tough guy asshole persona melted away for a good 60 seconds until he regained composure and made us all do push-ups. The push-ups were an easy price to pay for that moment. Story 5. Never was a drill sergeant, but when I was going through U.S. Army Infantry School in 2004, we were taking showers when one of the drills came in and called us to toe the line. When I got out of the shower, I found that someone had stolen my PT uniform and towel, so I grabbed my shaving cream and covered my cock in cream, then walked out to my bunk. The drill came up to me asking what the fuck I thought I was doing. I told him my clothes and towel were gone, so I did the next best thing. He said, "You know what? You're gonna do alright in the infantry. Modern problems require modern solutions." Story 6. You just reminded me of a breakfast one morning. Navy boot camp. I had made myself a deviled egg using hard-boiled, a packet of mayo, and one of mustard. A petty officer walked by and saw it on my tray and froze. "Recruit, what the hell is that?" "It's a deviled egg." "And where the hell did you get a deviled egg?" "I made it." "God damn it, recruit, that's the best frickin' idea I've ever seen. Carry on." "Yes." I'd been so terrified that I was gonna get in trouble for it for some reason. Just imagine if you'd had paprika, you would have been a legend. Story 7. I was a super light sleeper during basic training. One night I woke up for no reason. The sleeping bay was dark except for the light by the desk where the 2 soldiers on fire guard were supposed to be awake and alert. Both of them were leaning back in their chairs, dead asleep. I started to throw my covers off to go wake them up. If a drill sergeant came through and caught the fire guard sleeping, we would all pay. But then I heard a slow scraping sound to my right, off in the darkness. I froze and I heard it again. Closer. A few heartbeats later, and I almost screamed out as I saw the sharp, intense face of our Samoan drill instructor in the darkness. His face was covered in full camo and he was low-crawling underneath the line of the bunk bed toward the fire guard. He had a bayonet between his teeth. We locked eyes and he silently raised one finger to his mouth, signaling for silence. I nodded and sat back to watch the show as the drill sergeant resumed his low crawl under and past my bunk in the direction of the sleeping guards. I have a bunch of stories of funny crap I did to correct soldiers when I later became an NCO, non-commissioned officer, but that image is like something straight out of an 80s war movie. It will always stick with me. What? You didn't finish the story. How did it end? Story 8. So when you start your basic, your body doesn't know how to handle no sugar, caffeine, rigorous exercise, and sleep schedules, so it's in shock. With this shock, shitting became a problem for a few. Well, every drill instructor after the first week is required to ask if anyone has taken a shit. And from there, he assigns one recruit to track who has crapped and who has not. I shit you not, pun intended. We had one guy who would stand in the barracks at the end of each night, rolling off names of people who hadn't shit yet. Finally, we gave one guy who was still on there after 2 weeks, and the DI tells him to go to the doctor. The doctor gives him a get-out-of-jail-free card, essentially saying that at any point he may use the magical words, "I gotta shit," and he can escape any situation. Well, the recruit who can't shit gets the smart idea that he's gonna play his new trump card as long as possible. Every time that we're getting grilled, "I gotta take a shit" comes ringing in from the back of the formation. This probably happened 6 times until our drill instructor caught on. Finally, our drill instructor devises a plan that when the recruit who can't shit goes into the bathroom, he's gonna have a couple of us hold onto his legs and slide him into the stall all Exorcist style. The time comes and the recruit that can't shit excuses himself. We all follow our drill instructor into the bathroom and slid him under there like he's the spawn of Satan. This catches the recruit who can't shit by surprise. He doesn't know what the fuck is going on as the drill instructor is utterly berating him about lying and using this as an excuse to sit on the toilet. We hear a very audible "oh shit" from the stall. The drill instructor scared the recruit so much that he actually took a shit right then and there. The DI made every recruit look at it and we played taps for it as we flushed it down the toilet. Story 9. Just got off the trail a few months ago. The biggest standout for me was conducting a urinalysis, UA. We have a set of things we tell the soldiers to do. Wash your hands without soap, open the cup, place it on the urinal. At that point, I usually say, "Situate yourself and I think you can take the rest from there." This kid at that point tried to climb onto the top of the urinal to fill the cup still placed on top of it. I had to yell at him to stop and tell him to pick up the cup to urinate in it. I almost had to walk out because I was gonna lose it. In the probably 1,000 UAs that I had to be there for, I'd never seen a kid climb the urinal before. Thought of some more to add. One of the soldiers somehow got a forest ranger hat which looks pretty close to a drill sergeant campaign hat. He then started raiding the soldiers' rooms with the soldiers in them while his buddy recorded them on his phone. This is advanced individual training, so they have phones in semi-private 3-man rooms. We ended up finding the videos uploaded on Facebook and figured out who it was and who took the hat and disciplined him. However, the videos were funny as hell and his impressions of some of us were pretty spot on. And now for a fun thing I used to do to mess with them. So I was a drill sergeant in Advanced Individual Training AIT for the Army. In AIT, they have a bit more freedom and they can have certain things in their room. One of the things they like getting and usually hide in the locker would be a Google Mini or an Echo Dot. When doing room inspections of soldiers that had a shit room, I'd randomly say things like, "Okay Google, set an alarm for 1 a.m." or "Alexa, play Katy Perry at 2 a.m." I'd have super confused soldiers in the morning of physical training wondering why they had random alarms going off all night. Story 10. Not me, but I had a great team sergeant who had a floater, wonky eye that he was blind in from an injury in Iraq. So one eye was dead on and worked perfectly fine, but he had this other one Uncle Ruckus eye that just did its own thing. He was a very physically imposing man with that classic drill sergeant bass-filled voice, and his crazy eye just added to it, and he knew it. He told the story about his one time as a drill SGT when 2 privates had sat down on Firewatch and were kinda just being really lackadaisical about their duties when he found them. So he starts just giving them the business classic full metal jacket style, and finally he just ends his rant right when he's about to smoke them for who knows how long, when one of the privates just says, "Drill Sergeant, are you yelling at us or the water fountain?" It stopped him dead in his rage and he just walked away mid-knife hand. That could have gone very, very badly. A risky move that paid off. Story 11. Early in the boot in MCRD San Diego, we were post-shower and at attention for the hygiene inspection, wearing nothing but skivvies and t-shirts. The DI is walking the line, checking fingernails and whatnot, when one private's hard-on flops out of his skivvies right there as the DI passes him. The DI stops, looks at the private in the eye and says, "Private, I don't even like you. Much less like you that way. Now put that god thing away before it goes off." The private in question turned purple with embarrassment and tries to stuff his boner back in his skivvies, but is getting flustered as the DI starts yelling at him for being an incompetent private, and that if he didn't get it stowed in 3 seconds, the private would be taking a 10-minute cold shower. Things like, "Do I have to hose you down like an excited chihuahua? Should I call the vet? Good God, private, is that how you greet your mother at night? Stow your gear, goddammit!" Every other private in line was trying not to laugh as the second drill instructor had retreated to his office where we could hear him howling with laughter. The private finally gets his junk stowed and the DI resumes inspection, and you could see he was trying his damnedest not to bust out laughing. No one got much sleep that night. There were too many gigglers in their bunks and too many quiet one-liners. Story 12. 4 years ago. We had this kid who kept pissing himself. One day after the range, he informs our DI that he had shit himself right after the showers. Squad base starts to hold back laughter. DI, "It's not funny!" Awkward silence. DI, "Okay, it's a little funny, but we aren't laughing." The man never cracked a smile during the whole thing. Story 13. A buddy of mine told the story when he was at basic. One guy had said "yes ma'am" to the female DI earlier in the day, so when they were all lined up, he was going down the line asking each person if they called her ma'am earlier. The guy who did was fourth in line, heard the 3 previous guys say "no, drill sergeant," and then in all seriousness, "no ma'am." Story 14. My favorite basic story, Fort Benning, 1988, was during a locker inspection. The most steely-eyed, straight-laced drill sergeant we had was going through our stuff looking for contraband. He is asking random questions at the time, very professional and serious. Then he goes at a guy a few lockers down from me and asks if he has any naked pictures of his girlfriend. Recruit yells, "No, drill sergeant!" Drill sergeant looks at him dead in the eye and asks, "Do you want to buy some?" A bunch of us started cracking up and had to push. Damn, there's no way you could escape laughing at that. Story 15. Not a drill sergeant, but when I was in basic, I saw 3 drill sergeants surrounding a private who was laying down. They were all screaming, "Go the f*** to sleep right now, private. You take a goddamn nap this very second, you poor tired soul." Not exact words, but you get the gist of it. I still wonder how he got himself into that predicament. Caught sleeping can guarantee better than chanting stay awake, stay alive for a couple of hours. Story 16. On day 2 of basic training in Lackland Air Force Base, my flight was returning with our newly issued gear after having our heads shaved, and others hurry up and wait for their task. Our new training instructor told us to go upstairs and stand attention by our beds. We ran up there tired after attempting to march for what felt like 2 hours each way in the August Texas heat. We're all standing there waiting for whatever's going to happen next. After about 5 minutes, Donnie Barnes says, "That Sergeant Gates is an asshole, am I right?" As soon as Barnes said Gates, the locker directly behind Barnes opened up with a creak. Barnes is frozen solid. Out of the locker pops one leg after another and 3 taps as Sergeant Gates walks out of the locker and puts his mouth directly next to Barnes' ear and shouts in his gravelly voice, "On your face!" We did so many push-ups. And yeah, I just felt like yelling there. Story 17. One recruit left his training guide just lying on his rack. My lead recruit division commander decided this was punishable by making the recruit stand in the middle of our berthing, hold the training guide in the left hand, salute it with the right hand, and bring it in gently and whisper, "I love you, training guide. I'm sorry I left you. I'll never leave you lying around again." That shit was hilarious, especially because we were all put at attention while he did it for 45 minutes. Story 18. Not a drill sergeant, but went to Army Basic. I was in the chow line, nut to butt, looking at the back of the guy's head in front of me. All of a sudden, I can feel one of my drill sergeants breathing on me over the separation walls, and he yells, "Shia LaBeouf, who is your daddy?" To which I responded, "You are, drill sergeant." My other drill sergeant sprints over and says, "Oh yeah, then what does that make me then?" And all I thought to say was, "My mommy, drill sergeant?" Every drill sergeant in the chow hall was dying, and I got the dog shit smoked out of me outside. Edit. I have plenty more stories either equally funny or possibly even funnier. When I was in advanced individual training to be a medic at Fort San, we had to toe in line for bed check, standing on a yellow line by your bunk in PT/shower shoes holding your ID card with your tags hanging out. We used to f*** with each other hard in our bay, and right before our toe line, one of my buddies hid one of my shower shoes. So I'm in a rush thinking, fuck, okay, I'll just wear one. So I'm standing at half attention in one flip-flop and my bare foot is just kinda tucked away behind me. Our cadre for check comes and just looks directly down at my feet, crosses his arms and says, "Shillaboof, what in Sam f*** are you doing?" All I could get out to say was, "Sergeant, I could not find my other shower shoe for bed check." And I think he'd been saving this one because he started to smirk and just yelled, "God damn it, Shia LaBeouf, you are more ate up than a chocolate dick in a gay bar," triggering giggles and snickers throughout the bay. Story 19. I'll never forget this one. When a recruiter would bust ass, we would make them turn on the vacuum cleaner. This meant we would yell, "Who the f*** just shit themselves? This recruit is attempting to attack our olfactory sense. Platoon, turn on the vacuum." Which would be followed by, "Turn on the vacuum, aye sir." And then all the recruits would suck in through their mouth as hard as they could. However, one time we had a recruit who immediately answered when we asked who shit themselves, that "This recruit shit himself, sir." Turns out Recruit Jones shit himself during late-night drill session in 3rd phase. By then, recruits are disciplined and almost always put on the mission first, even if that mission is executing left-face march without asking to go to head. Poor kid sat in his own shit for almost 2 hours. Story 20. Not a DI, but when I went through basics, they gave everyone a flashlight with a lime green yellow thing on the bright end that you had to have with you in the morning for PT. Well, one individual forgot his, and when we all lined up in the morning, he didn't say anything until we all walked over to the PT pad. The DI began to berate him and tell him that he is a dumbass and run back to the bunks to retrieve a flashlight. Before he leaves, the TI yells, "If anyone stops you, just tell them you're a dumbass." Well, a TI was crossing the street and saw him running back to the bunks, and saw the trainee all by himself, so he started laying into him. We could all hear him on the PT pad until the trainee got a chance to respond with, "Sir, trainee so-and-so reports as ordered. I am a dumbass." And the TI walks away and didn't say anything. I have another story about these exact airmen. Near the end of basic training, depending on who your DI is, you might get what is called an amnesty hour. It's everyone who's been in basic with you and your DI basically talking to you like a normal person again. Well, our DI opened the floor for questions, and the first kid to raise his hand was the kid who forgot his Lackland laser. During all of basic when I was there, a rumor was going around that a DI had been posed for Playboy. No, it was a rumor, but no one could go on a computer to Google it because it's basic military training. The airman stood up and asked straight-face, "Sir, is it true that a DI posed for Playboy?" Our DI laughed and confirmed the rumor. And again, "Sir, did you meet this DI?" Our DI responded with, "No, but if I did, I would be tapping that." Without missing a beat, this short, skinny kid from Tennessee says, "Thank you for not hitting it so the rest of us don't fall in it." I cried laughing. Story 21. A pair of battle buddies were late to the formation. Everyone was lined up waiting for them to get dressed, but they ran down about 3 seconds apart from each other, which was a big mistake. The first one runs out, drill sergeant screams, "Freeze, motherfucker! Aren't you supposed to have someone with you?" And without skipping a beat, the private replies, "The force is always with me, drill sergeant." After thinking about it for a sec, he told the private to shut up and fall in line. His buddy, meanwhile, had made his way outside and was trying to poorly sneak into line. Drill sergeant sees the private sneaking. "Well, now hold on a f***ing second. Who's this fucking big shot over here walking around like he owns the place? Do you have your new top? You think you're special?" Private, "No, drill sergeant, I'm the force." Everyone, including the lead drill, lost their fucking shit for 2 seconds. See, this right here is genius. You know they had that planned out in advance, just in case. Story 22. Not a drill instructor, but when I was going through basic, it was one trainee's birthday when we went to the gas chamber for an experience of the crowd control gas. This trainee happened to be Jewish, so the first thing in the morning when we had this little huddle about what's going to happen that day, the DI asks if there are any questions. Trainee Goldberg, that's not his real name, but this dude was built like Goldberg, raised his hand and says, "Sir, don't you think it's a little f***ed up to send a Jew to the gas chambers on his birthday?" Everyone busted up laughing, including our DI, but the story doesn't end there. We go to the dining facility for breakfast, and as he's going through the line, our DI yells, "Trainee Goldberg, why don't you tell the other DIs what you told me this morning?" With a straight face, Trainee Goldberg says, "Oh, I was just telling our DI how it's pretty fucked up that the Air Force is sending Jews to the gas chamber on his birthday." All the DIs at the long table just fell silent, almost scared, and our DI just busted up laughing so hard that all the trainees stopped. Trainee Goldberg, despite being 6'2" with solid muscles, was perhaps the funniest guy in our flight. He owns a few gyms now in his home state. Awesome guy.
Serious. What was the dirtiest trick ever pulled in the history of war? Story 1. In the trenches of France during World War I, General Monash was given the unenviable task of punching through the German line to claim the French town of La Hemelle. The way that Monash went about doing this was both revolutionary and bloody sneaky. The German forces were well equipped and well fortified, reinforced with heavy artillery and machine guns, and the troops were very well trained. Faced with these odds, Monash began to, quote-unquote, condition the German forces. Every day at dawn, he would let loose a barrage of smoke bombs followed by mustard gas canisters. The Germans, following their training, would equip themselves with gas masks that protected them. Monash kept up this bombardment for 2 weeks, and soon the Germans became accustomed to the pattern of attack and would immediately don their gas masks and hunker down at the first sign of smoke. But on the dawn of the 4th of July, the smoke bombs were not followed by gas, but by the Australians. The German gas masks protected them from mustard gas and smoke, but they also vastly impeded their vision, hearing, and ability to communicate. With the noise of the battle and the obscuring smoke, they were deaf and blind on the battlefield, and to make things worse, this was not an unprotected infantry massed attack, but a creeping barrage supported by a division of tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft. The tanks protected the vulnerable infantry, and the artillery and aircraft prevented the Germans from effectively deploying anti-tank measures. The battle was over in just 90 minutes and marked the rise of mixed arms warfare. Story 2. The British pulled a dirty trick during the African campaign in World War II. At every well and oasis they could find, they hung a sign that said "Danger, Poison" in English and German. It was only when the Germans complained that poisoning wells were a war crime that the British pointed out that, yes, poisoning wells was a crime, but merely hanging signs were not. The water was perfectly drinkable. Story 3. Not sure if this counts as a quote-unquote trick, but Napoleon prior to the Battle of Marengo. Not only did he cross the Alps with his entire army, a completely unexpected move, but once across, the Austrians thought Napoleon would move to Genoa in order to relieve the siege of that city. Thousands were dying of starvation, and French General Massena desperately called for Napoleon's aid. Napoleon, in a ruthless and surprising move, ignored the calls for help and instead moved to attack the main portion of the Austrian army, eventually winning the Battle of Marengo. Massena surrendered Genoa, and it would be years before he eventually forgave Napoleon for abandoning him, and it would be years before Napoleon forgave Massena for surrendering. Story 4. The Battle of Majnoon in the Iraqi-Iranian War. You wait until nighttime and you will see how we are killing these Iranian dogs, an Iraqi officer said with a broad grin. We are frying them like eggplants. He then took us an hour on a tour of dozens of thick electrical cables his troops had lain through the marshy battlefield, a spaghetti network that snaked in and out of the patchwork of lagoons. He showed us the mammoth electric generators that fed the exposed power lines from positions just behind the Iraqi front lines. And when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards made their regular evening advance, the officer and his men demonstrated the macabre genius of their invention. Iraqi gun batteries fired just enough artillery to force the Revolutionary Guards from their marsh boats, and when hundreds of them had been forced to continue their advance through the lagoons on foot, the men manning the Iraqi generators flipped a few switches and sent thousands of volts of electricity surging through the marshland. Within seconds, hundreds of Iranians were electrocuted. This occurred nightly. Story 5. Not so much the dirtiest trick as one of the most hard-nosed decisions. The first V-1 flying bombs, if you're under the age of 40, think first-generation cruise missiles, were being launched by Germany against London. And they were hitting. They were quote-unquote area weapons, as accuracy was pretty much a mile on any side of the aiming point, but they were coming down in central London. Germany had no agents in Britain, not one. They thought they did, but every agent they sent over was caught and then either turned or executed, and the other agents were all fictitious, imaginary ones dreamed up in a British campaign of disinformation that was and is breathtaking. The government decided that they simply didn't want to risk the buildings and architecture and heritage of the heart of London. Quite a lot had been bombed anyway. So the agents reported back to Berlin that the V-1s were overshooting their targets and coming down in North London. Fake stories planted in newspapers reinforced the deception. The Germans dutifully shortened the range, and the V-1s knocked the shit out of areas of South London. One reason why a lot of Croydon is 1960s concrete is because of the damage done by the V-1s in 1944. In short, someone said, quote, "Our people are going to die and our buildings are going to be flattened whatever happens, so let it be here." Story 6. A lot of these will be depressing ones. As dirty or sneaky tricks go, Operation Mincemeat was crafty, or at least I'm looking for an excuse to post it. One April morning in 1943, a sardine fisherman spotted the corpse of a British soldier floating in the sea off the coast of Spain, setting in train a course of events that would change the course of World War II. Operation Mincemeat was the most successful wartime deception ever attempted, and certainly the strangest. It hoodwinked Nazi espionage chiefs, sent German troops racing in the wrong direction, and saved thousands of lives by deploying a secret agent who was different in one crucial respect from any spy before or since. He was dead. His mission was to convince the Germans that instead of attacking Sicily, the Allied armies would invade Greece. The brainchild of an eccentric Royal Air Force officer and a brilliant Jewish barrister, this great deception involved an extraordinary cast of characters, including Ian Fleming, who would go on to write the James Bond stories, a famous forensic pathologist, a beautiful Secret Service secretary, a submarine captain, pre-novelist, and an irascible admiral who loved fly fishing and a dead Welsh tramp. Using fraud, imagination, and seduction, Winston Churchill's team of spies spun a web of deceit so elaborate and so convincing that they began to believe it themselves. From a windowless basement beneath Whitehall, the hoax traveled from London to Scotland to Spain to Germany and ended up on Hitler's desk. Story 7. Operation Fortitude, D-Day. The Allies, for months and months, had been spreading disinformation and building up dummy armies and equipment from across from Pas de Calais. 6 fictional divisions were created, and with all kinds of radio traffic to match the activity of said divisions. Why was Pas de Calais important during World War II? Well, it was the closest land point to England. So many German generals, with the help of some Allied misdirection, strongly believed that when the Allies made the push into Fortress Europe, it would be at Pas de Calais, and based on the evidence, the attack would take place mid to late July. Hitler, who liked to micromanage, believed the attack was coming to Pas de Calais to a devastating degree. With heavy weather rolling in over the first few days of June, many on the German side had no idea that the attack was coming. Field Marshal Rommel, the man in charge of the defenses in France, based on intel, felt that there was no way the Allies would invade. So he took off back to Germany to surprise his wife for her birthday. The remaining German generals in the area had planned readiness exercises over June 5th and 6th to help prepare their troops for the upcoming invasion. When the Allies started their invasion by air the night before the sea landings, confusion on the German side was complete. The local resistance fighters were busy cutting phone lines and blowing up bridges. The paratroopers were hitting key locations. But at the same time, the Allies were also dropping dummies with firecrackers. So, some initial reports of Allied troops parachuting in were dismissed as nothing more than dummies with firecrackers. Some thought it was part of an exercise. I recall reading about one general who was sitting at his HQ listening to all the various reports, not quite sure what to make of everything, when all of a sudden an American paratrooper landed on the front lawn. Morning came around and the reports started coming in. Invasion is occurring in Normandy, and unfortunately for the Germans, those in charge back in Berlin didn't believe it. By 9:10 in the morning, the landings were under full swing. Berlin was fully aware of the situation. However, the generals who were in Berlin with Hitler decided not to wake Hitler, as the Allies weren't landing in Pas de Calais. As such, this was seen as a diversionary attack. Rommel finally made it back to France, assessed the situation, and requests that his panzer army be released so that he could drive the Allies back into the sea. It's important to note that many historians believe that had Rommel been allowed to move his tanks forward, it's very likely that they would have repelled the Allied invasion. But no, he was refused, and it wasn't until Hitler woke up around 2 or 3 in the afternoon on D-Day that he released the panzer armies to Rommel. At this point, though, it was much too late. Bridges were destroyed and Allies had control of the air about the area of operation. The Allies had cracked Fortress Europe, and it was the beginning but the end for the Germans. Story 8. The actor George Sanders found out that his friend David Niven was very chummy with Winston Churchill during the war. He asked Niv to give the Prime Minister a note detailing his idea for a new bomb that the RAF could drop on German cities. It would be exactly the same as all the old bombs, except it would have a wind-activated siren attached to it. So when the bombs dropped, the German civilian population hiding in shelters would hear the siren, think that the all-clear was being sounded, and come out just as the bombs hit. Niven didn't say how Churchill took the idea. Story 9. Counterterrorism and anti-crime units have been seeding black market arms dealers with C4 explosive-laced ammo. Now when fired, the bullets tend to have a small explode effect on the weapons, rendering the weapon useless, and typically giving the user non-lethal but disfiguring hand and facial injuries. This bad ammo looks and feels like every other bullet that the dealer has sold, so the only solution is to stop using that arms dealer. Now you can't trust your existing arms dealer, and you have to find a new one that may or may not have tainted ammo, or even be a Fed. In essence, it shuts down an entire illegal arms industry at the cost of about 1 or 2 crates of C4 bullets mixed in with the others. Story 10. Genghis Khan, in a large-scale attack against a fortress at Volohai, after being unable to breach the walls, demanded 1,000 cats and 10,000 Chinese swallows in exchange for lifting the siege. When the defenders sent out the animals, Genghis took them and tied tufts of cotton to their tails and ignited them, at which point the animals rushed back to their homes within the city, igniting hundreds of small fires, while Genghis's army attacked again and took the fortress amidst the panic. Story 11. Not sure if it's been mentioned yet or not, but the Ghost Army was a pretty great trick. Maybe not dirty, but still really clever and underhanded. The 1,100-man unit was given a unique mission within the Allied army, to impersonate other Allied army units to deceive the enemy. From a few weeks after D-Day, when they landed in France, until the end of the war, they put on a quote-unquote traveling roadshow, utilizing inflatable tanks, sound trucks, fake radio transmissions, scripts, and pretense. They staged more than 20 battlefield deceptions, often operating very close to the front lines. Their story was kept secret for more than 40 years after the war, and elements of it remain classified. I think that's so fucking cool. You had entire airfields full of fake planes and shit. And Germany was running around going crazy over it, but it was all fake. So perfect. Plus, the insignia is really badass. Mr. Ghost just dropping some sick lightning bolts. Story 12. I read somewhere about a high-ranking officer in the Chinese military that was infamous among enemies and allies for his cleverness and ability to come up with unique war tactics. During some wars, the enemy army was marching towards some strategically valuable location. The general, knowing he could not let this army take the location, rode to a town that the army had to pass through to get there and sets up his plan. As the enemy army approaches the town, they see this general, all alone, sitting on an arch above the entrance, playing the flute. They turn right the fuck around and abandon the plan, fearing some brutal and elaborate ambush. The general was bluffing. He was the only person there. Story 13. I've got the winner, as written by the inimitable Gary Brecker. The British invaded Tibet in 1904 basically because they were bored. I'm serious. They owned everything on the planet worth having, so they were always having to invent new menaces to get funding for more invasions, grabbing the places they hadn't considered worth taking in their earlier waves of conquest. So in the late 1800s, they started talking up the Russian threat to swarm over the Himalayas and take away India. That was such utter crap that even the Brits talking up the threat must have had a laugh about it over their port back at the officers' club. Russia was weak, so weak that the Japanese crushed it on land and sea in 1905. The British knew Russia was in no position to threaten India. What they wanted was an easy conquest that would produce lots of medals, honors, and stuff to wear on their chests in the London social season so they could snag an heiress and never have to work again. So they invaded Tibet. The guy who ran that invasion, Francis Younghusband, was quite a piece of work himself. One of those India-born Brits who were generally fiercer and crazier even than the homegrown English. And he had that other feature that makes for a really ruthless conqueror. He was, as his biographies say, quote-unquote, deeply religious. If you hear that about a guy who's about to invade your country, go down to the basement, hoard lots of water and canned goods, and try to make yourself invisible for the next few years because it's not going to be pretty. Younghusband marched into Tibet in December 1903 with a force of Sikhs and Gurkhas, a pretty scary mix, like Rottweiler plus Pitbull. And the Gurkhas were definitely the pitbulls in that pair. Sikhs are very tough but not blood crazy. The Gurkhas were not only devoted lovers of knife work, especially on prisoners of wars, but ancient enemies of the Tibetans. It didn't take much to push them to a massacre. The Tibetans knew the British were dangerous and tried not to resist at all, but as the British force pushed farther and farther into Tibet, the local commanders decided to resist. That was a mistake. This wasn't Tony Blair's cool Britannia they were dealing with. On March 31, 1904, Younghusband encountered a Tibetan militia force of about 2,000 guarding a pass near Gyantse. He must have had a hard time keeping a straight face or wiping the drool from his lips, thinking about the medals he'd get for this one, because the Tibetans were armed either with spears and swords, or at best with matchlock muskets. That's right, the kind of 17th century firearm that won't fire unless you apply the smoldering wick to the firing pan. Younghusband decided to play with the poor f***ers he was facing. He said, my friends, what's all this hostility? What's this paranoia? Here, I'll tell my soldiers to take the bullets out of their rifles, and you tell your soldiers to put out the flame of their matchlocks." The Tibetans, who had no idea that Younghusband's troops had modern repeating rifles, put out their matchlocks. Younghusband then ordered his troops to open fire. 1,300 Tibetans were killed with almost no British casualties. Younghusband thought it was a great triumph, but this was already late in the imperial era, and the people back home had had enough of this kind of triumph. In fact, it sort of made them sick. The whole thing was hushed up and remains hushed up to this day. Ask any Brit you know if they ever heard of their invasion of Tibet, and I guarantee they'll plead ignorance. It's probably better that way too. Makes it easy to put one of those Free Tibet Rising Sun stickers on your Land Rover without feeling like a hypocrite. Story 14. Madeleine de Verchères was a 14-year-old girl in New France, now Quebec, in 1692, was left in charge of Fort Verchères with one old man and a handful of soldiers to guard her and the settlers, while her parents, her father was a seigneur of the fort, went to gather winter supplies. They were out tending the gardens when the Iroquois attacked and made off with most of the soldiers. She was grabbed but untied some clothing and escaped. She made it to the fort, closed the gates, and fired off some muskets to make the Iroquois think that there were more than just her, the old man, and 2 soldiers left in the fort. Over the next few days, she led other families into the fort in the guise of bringing in reinforcements, and moved around the fort firing guns and marching on the bastions to make it appear as if there was a substantial garrison. The Iroquois held off their attack. Reinforcements from Montreal finally arrived, and she handed command to them just after the Iroquois left for an easier target. This is like Home Alone, Medieval Edition. Story 15. Operation Grief by the Germans in World War II. The idea was that German soldiers would infiltrate the Americans by wearing American uniforms, traveling in American vehicles, and speaking American English, in such a way that they would be able to relay false orders and gather American intel. Quite an interesting and deceptive idea, but it didn't really go as planned. They weren't able to muster that many German troops who could speak American English and know about American culture and idioms. Additionally, they didn't have that many American vehicles, so they would either use captured Sherman tanks that had already been shot to shit, or their own tanks disguised in such a way that at first they'd look like they were Shermans, but upon closer inspection, could be seen to be German tanks. Furthermore, it became difficult for the actual German soldiers to tell the difference between the American soldiers and their fellow German soldiers in disguise. However, it did succeed in creating some suspicions among the Americans. For example, soldiers would start asking each other questions that they felt only genuine Americans would know the real answer to. Another example is when General Omar Bradley was held by American soldiers for several hours because they suspected him of being a German in disguise. It wasn't only until another general arrived and was able to identify General Bradley that he was finally released. Basically a good plan in theory, but didn't fully work in practice. Story 16. I don't know that it was the dirtiest trick, but Project Eldest Son certainly deserves note. The project focused on the placement of exploding cartridges into supplies used by the communist combat forces in Southeast Asia. Basically, special forces would find ammo caches in the jungle while out on recon, but instead of destroying it, they would replace one in every few dozen or so rounds with specially crafted rounds packed with high explosive instead of smokeless powder. An AK-47 chamber is rated for about 50,000 psi. The HE they used produced around 250,000 psi. The resulting random explosions maimed users, sowing distrust and paranoia toward their weapons among the rest of the forces, heavily demoralizing them. Story 17. During the War of 1812, North American edition, British and First Nation forces countered a series of American raids by besieging Detroit. British Major General Isaac Brock and Shawnee leader Tecumseh had a smaller force than American Brigadier General William Hull, and of course didn't have the advantage of a fort, so they decided to play a ruse. A false letter was allowed to be captured by the Americans stating that over 5,000 First Nation fighters, double the size of Hull's forces, had arrived across the river at Amherstburg and that they should stop coming as it was straining supply lines. Brock sent a letter to Hull advising surrender and claiming to have little control over Tecumseh's warriors. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond control the moment the contest commences. Brock then dressed up his militia in the excess uniforms of regulars, implying a more seasoned force. He had his soldiers light individual campfires at night instead of a single fire per unit. And then the piece de resistance. They marched their soldiers in a big circle partly inside of the American position, making it look like their ranks were endless. Brock and Tecumseh took Detroit and captured 2,500 soldiers, a larger force than their own, suffered only 2 wounded. Story 18. During medieval times in northern Italy, in the region of Piedmont, a city was being besieged. This big city was protected by walls, so the best way to win for the invading army was to wait until the city ran out of food. After a few months, people were starving, and the only thing left were a few bags of rice and a couple of cows. People gathered in a town hall to evaluate the possibility of surrender. They determined that the city had food to last a few more weeks, and during the meeting, a young boy had an idea. A few days later, that boy came out of the city walls with one of the last few cows left inside the town. He approached the besieging army commander and asked if he could throw the cow out of the city because there was a lack of space due to the enormous amount of food they still had. The army commander looked at the cow and saw it was fat, and the boy replied, "We also had to feed the cow rice because of the lack of space in the food storage. Everything is full." The army commander killed the cow and cut it open and saw that there was rice inside its stomach. Thinking that the city could last for years until it surrendered, the army commander stopped the siege and went away. Story 19. This one's a bit more cheeky than dirty. But the fact that the Germans, when manufacturing the new version of the carabiner and named it the Carbiner 98 Kurz. This obviously was because they weren't allowed to make bolt-action rifles, but only allowed to make carbines. And Kurz, of course, means short, so basically it was a carbine version of the regular carabiner. Except that it wasn't a carbine at all and was only named that to fool the others. Again, not that dirty, but cheeky.
Has anyone here ever been a soldier fighting against the US? What was it like? Story 1. I was just a 7-year-old kid when my parents were watching CNN and BBC while I was playing video games. It was about some army jets taking off during the night. My dad turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It has begun. Get to the basement now." Sometime later, the first explosions could be heard. The NATO and US bombing of Serbia in '99 had started. I remember spending time in the basement with other residents. I remember how the building shook when the bombs exploded. The fear of what was coming after the sirens went off. They destroyed all 3 bridges across the Danube in my city, cutting us off from a part of our family. One day a bomb hit the refinery, so we couldn't stay in the basement anymore because of CO2. Then a bomb hit about 100 meters from our building, and shrapnel went through the blinds and windows and embedded itself into the opposite wall of our neighbor's flat. That's when we decided to move somewhere where the Americans had nothing to aim for, a smaller town. We were safer there, but we could still hear the jets flying above us and bombs going off in the distance. When someone shot down the F-117 stealth jet, it was a huge hell yeah moment for Serbia. That's my short story about surviving a war versus USA. Story 2. In World War II, the Germans, and some of our allies, often commented on how chaotic the US Army appeared to be. I believe the quote was, "War is chaos, and the American Army practices it on a daily basis." Other armies were slow, disciplined, methodical, etc. The perception was that Americans were unpredictable and undisciplined, but prone to ingenuity. Not just our generals, but right down to the grunt soldier level. I understand most who fought us viewed this as a great strength. I remember reading an article a while back that one of the reasons Americans were so unpredictable to Europeans was the fact that we were one of the first national armies to use guerrilla tactics, and then we literally got a masterclass fighting the various Indian wars. Story 3. I had the opportunity to be an opposing force, pretend baddies for special operations, Spec Ops raid one night recently. We all had basic roles to play to make sure the good guys got to practice at typical scenarios, but we were allowed to do whatever we wanted within the confines of the role we were given. My role was to be a squirter from the main target building. When the raid rolled up, I was to fire off some rounds and bolt as fast as possible over a hilly area and take up cover in an adjacent building. Then, when and if they came to my building, try to light up as many good guys as possible before being shot. The blacked out Hummers roll up, and I unload my rounds. After emptying a mag, I bolt for the second building. I'm not usually a nervous type of person, but it was either the sprint or the fact that those Hummers were really terrifying. But my heart rate didn't slow down after I'd stopped running. I remember thinking of 2 things. First, how strange it was that I was so scared since I knew we were using simulation and this was a war game. And second, I knew for a fact that I was going to die. I was outnumbered and outmatched. They had night vision and I was armed with a single AK-47. The sense of dread was really vivid, and I remember imagining noises and sights and kept playing out an operator sneaking up behind me in my mind. The next surprising thing was when they rolled up to my building. They weren't sneaky or silent as I imagine in books, just as before. Yet they also weren't yelling at each other, as I had learned from cop shows when they clear rooms. They were all talking to each other in calm voices and using first names, relaying information about the current situation in a methodical manner. I had left the light at one corner of the building in hopes that I could spring a trap from the other corner. I turned the corner and unloaded a mag as fast as possible at the parked Hummer, barely aiming. All I could think about is the 10 to 20 guns all silently hunting from the slightest movement. Then, and I'll never forget this, I saw the eeriest sight imaginable. A red dot, bigger than I'd pictured or ever seen at the range, raced across the sand toward me. As I threw in a new mag and turned the other direction to check my 6, I had just enough time to catch the second red dot repeating the first's move as if they were synchronized divers. I've never been more impressed and mortified in my life. The next thing I felt was pretty surreal. In short, I was hit in the chest and in the back at the exact same moment by 2 operators rounding the side of the building. I was in a corner. As I retreated from one side of the building to the other, fearing the first shooter, I ran directly into his counterpart. Their bullets, simulation, contacted me at approximately the same place in my chest and my back. I listened to them clear the inside of the building. Those same cool methodical voices, first names, nothing like what I imagined. Then they searched my dead body. They began to take off my mask, paintball-type contraption, to ID my face. And the plastic was cutting into my eyebrow, so I reached up to help them take it off without hurting me. One of the operators standing watch over me almost shot me, and politely asked me to inform them verbally of any other movements I would make. Anyway, to wrap this long story up, afterward I met all the guys that were on the op. There were about 20. They were all smart as hell. Many of them had gone to college and enlisted anyway, in order to join Spec Ops. Several of them spoke multiple languages, and none of them were what I imagined. They were humble, completely professional, and extremely thankful for us volunteers that they lit up. Basically, I don't know how it would feel to fight US soldiers with real ammo. It made me pray I never will. It seemed pointless. These guys weren't practicing with air support that night. It would have been even more terrifying with that on my mind. Also, a friend of mine who is an operator wasn't sure why they'd have red dots equipped while using night vision goggles. I have no idea. I just know what I saw. Maybe it was an intimidation factor? I don't know. It almost made me shit myself. Story 4. My father was a sniper during the bombardment in Yugoslavia, and my best friend's father was a member of the elite unit called Tigers while the war in Kosovo was raging. I'll be short because I have to sleep, but my father told me it was like trying to repel a wave on the beach by building a castle out of the sand. You fought, and you may have won some small encounters, be it by accident or pure luck, but you always knew that if they wanted, they could just kill us all and be done with it. Not a nice time for Yugoslavia, that's for sure. Story 5. My grandfather was conscripted to fight for the North Korean military during the Korean War. He was at the Battle of Incheon, and he likened the dread that he felt to what one must feel when faced with a massive tidal wave that is about to engulf you and everyone you know. Couple this with the fact that many North Korean troops were told horror stories, that the American troops were cannibals, for example, and that the average American Marine was much taller and more physically robust than the average North Korean soldier. You can imagine how scared he was. He said that the Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated and that they never stood a chance against the Marines. All his words, not mine. Story 6. I'm a sapper in the Australian Army, and I've spent months living out bush performing enemy party, basically OP4. We wore different uniforms, usually Vietnam olive drab or desert cams, grew beards, and lived like insurgents. So one does pick up the thought patterns of a soldier fighting a coalition army. Half the day was spent killing time, reading, talking smack in politics, playing cards, eating rations, and the rest was combat and cereals. So we'd march out to a position and hit the soldiers' troop harbor at night, probing, trying to capture weapons, and packs or being challenged and bumping them with a few rounds before withdrawing. The majority of the combat tasks were during the day, however. We'd perform ambushes and conduct prisoner, wounded, and surrendering serials. One thing that was surprising was how often soldiers, particularly officer cadets, would commit war crimes. Clear violations of the laws of armed combat. Most of them were accidental, a few not. One example was I observed a scout and then withdrew to the edge of a clearing until I had a visual of the rest of the section. I bumped a few rounds and waited for them to advance with fire and movement while my partner moved around the rear. Once they were within 40 meters of my position, then I would display that I had surrendered, rifle raised above my head or hands up shouting, "Next schießen!" Almost consistently, I was shot after they ceased fire by one of the members of the section. Commonly one would fire and the rest would open up. And twice I was clearly executed, at close distance and verbal contact, then shot with blanks. This is training, but it was surprising. The chaos of a firefight would create a friendly or enemy mentality, and no gray zone emerged for wounded combatants or surrendering parties. Also factoring in trigger-happy 18-year-olds, and a pure training environment may account for this. But still, it was interesting. We also did civilian interactions, with no weapons and us wearing Hawaiian shirts and jeans. 50% we'd be lit up, and 50% they would challenge and conduct prisoner handling. Thoughts on being an enemy was being how men in pairs against a section, we were able to observe the enemy for a while, follow and note how they perform. The majority were very professional. In the bush, a section, 8 men in 2 squads including a signaler with radio, 2 machine gunners, 2 scouts, etc., is rather loud even when they're trying to be cautious. Also, despite the odds, an enemy who opens an engagement might hit 2 or 3 before the rest of the section advances and can close and kill. I noted also how you can exploit Western ROE, rules of engagement. Like in one position, I opened up from a tree on an advancing unit. I got at least 4 of a section, then I surrendered, fell out of the tree. It was a bad fall. Here I was able to eliminate half a section and due to the rules of war be captured and remain alive. Chances are, if I wasn't shot, I'd be fed, clothed and sheltered after killing 4 of their countrymen. Interesting thought when I reflect on a real-world example. Story 7. My great-uncle fought on the German side of World War II. He fought all over the place. Africa, Italy, in a small stint in Russia, and he defended France from the D-Day invasion. He was later able to move to the United States as a war refugee. He said that all of his officers would constantly tell him, when you're fighting the Americans, you must think of the least possible way they will attack you, because that will be the way that they attack you. He also said that when you were fighting Americans more so than any other country's army he fought, you had to have eyes in the back of your head. Story 8. While I cannot speak from experience, I'm an American, and I can relay something my father mentioned to me a few years ago. He was a Marine during the conflict in Grenada, and he was also active during the First Gulf War. He has never gone into great detail about his combat history, and frankly, I wouldn't want to have him rewalk those memories. But he did mention one time how you can see a man's fear before you see him. Kind of cryptic, I know, but that one statement says a lot. He mentioned how you could hear them yelling and that the yells were not the confident kind. He meant that these men knew they were about to fight Americans. With all their fancy toys and extreme training, they knew that the Marines were coming to kill them. My dad always told me that one of the greatest weapons our military has is the image that we conjure in the minds of our enemies. While it is one thing to fight someone who you feel is an equal or less match to you, it is a completely different scenario to fight someone who you truly feel is a monstrous force of war. I can't speak for the other branches strictly because I don't have a close personal relationship with someone who's enlisted, and I have never enlisted. However, I can tell you that my father and all of his Marine buddies are absolutely vicious if prodded into an aggressive situation. Story 9. My great-uncle fought for the Germans in the Battle of Normandy. He said that they were told that the Allies were being pushed back into the sea, and that any Allies they saw were most likely small units that had slipped by. A few days later, my great-uncle woke up to find a regiment of Americans camped within sight of the farmhouse they were in. He and his squad surrendered. Story 10. Former active Army infantry here. Not sure how I'd feel if I met someone who told me they were former JAM, Jaish al-Mahdi. There were dozens of different armed groups fighting each other and fighting the coalition forces at the same time. The first deployment, it was mostly the Mahdi army. On the one hand, a lot of them were poor unemployed kids with zero prospects for employment or education. The only possible option for them was to grab a rifle and show up with the rest of the ski masks and run into coaxial machine gun fire, or dig a hole for $20 and get blown apart by an Apache. So I have some empathy for the plight of the poor, uneducated, unemployed Shiite youth who took up arms to fight the imperialist stormtrooper invaders. Sure, yeah, if Red Dawn happened, I'd be in the woods with the Wolverines too. Roger that. On the other hand, kidnappings, torture, rape, execution, burning of the Sunnis out of their homes, corruption of the police force, and the 3 dead preteens we found kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. The 10-year-old kid was shot in the head right in front of me by a sniper. The 90-plus civilian murder victims we found just in the first month of our combat tour. The kid whose tongue they cut out because he liked to chat with us when we rolled by his neighborhood. The fact that Muqtada al-Sadr is now an officially recognized member of the Iraqi government. So yeah, I can't do it. I can't forgive them. Story 11. My great-grandfather talked to me about being a Canadian in World War II. When a Canadian plane flew overhead, the Germans dove for cover. When a German plane flew overhead, the Canadians dove for cover. When an American plane flew overhead, everybody dove for cover. Story 12. My family is Panamanian. Being a civilian in a country invaded by US troops is terrifying. Tanks stopped in front of my grandma's house and started firing over it once. The cousins were all really young when it happened and they were absolutely terrified. Unfortunately, I don't have access to someone who may have fought for Noriega, the dictator at the time that the US was ousting. Story 13. Not the enemy, but was in communications. We would get intel from counter-intel guys from intercepted cell phone calls. Taliban was scared shitless when it came to engaging Marines. One report that I remember well was the commander ordering guys to engage in firefights because they wanted to do a show of force. The guy who was ordering gave a million excuses and was scared of the new Marines because they thought we were special forces. We had a bunch of new gear, chest rigs, radios, and thermals. They ended up engaging a patrol later that week. We killed most of their cell that day. Story 14. My girlfriend has family that fought against the US. The fighters didn't have any choice. They were taken from their families. Then they were trained and brainwashed. If they were to disobey, they would be killed on the spot. Some of the fighters escaped, but others weren't so lucky. The escapees were often captured, interrogated, and tortured. Pretty much what I'm getting at is that these people didn't have a choice. If they were educated in the politics of the situation, they would have gladly joined the US. They were dogs in a chain. Story 15. I'm actually a former US Army. I spent an entire summer serving as an OPFOR, opposing force at one of the Army's elite training centers. Basically, I fought US soldiers in a giant simulation. I'd actually agreed to some extent with the pushover comments for some units. The US Army is just so damn massive, some units certainly would look completely incompetent. Also, outside of a few special operations units and light infantry, there isn't a whole lot of emphasis placed in toughness. However, combat arms units are no freaking joke. We have the best, most expensive training in the world and by far the best equipment. I would not want to be on the other team. Chances are I'd be dead before I even saw an American soldier. Another former US Army OPFOR soldier here. I spent 6 years doing this, though not 6 months. I worked in Germany, so I not only got to work with the US, but most of the European NATO forces in some capacity over the 6 years. Most of my work was with mechanized forces, but I was light infantry by trade. It wasn't often that we got to do light infantry work, but I would do as many recon missions as I could to get out of the tin box that we had to run around in. Now, keep in mind I was there in the mid to late 90s, and things like experience have changed a lot since then with all the deployments the military has seen over the years. Back then, we would primarily work with units stationed in Europe. They had a huge disadvantage. They were in our backyard, they didn't get field time as we did. We averaged 300 plus days a year in field, so they were not as skilled as us. Most of the units in Europe didn't have much for training facilities other than the once or twice a year they came to work with us. Units in the US I feel would put up a little better fight. At times we would work with the special operations units, SOF, Rangers, and such, and as you would expect, there was a night and day difference. They had better equipment, were better motivated, and had larger training budgets. This made them a tougher fight, but I will leave it at that. A lot of time the political side of things would step in. This would happen when other people may be watching or things would happen remotely because we were doing a little too good. I lost count of how many times a general would step in and cancel an artillery strike that I called in because it would take out too many of his people. At first, I would get pissed, but later I realized that by denying my strike, they would get to continue to fight a little longer and maybe a little more training out of it rather than have to sit on the sidelines and watch, because I took them out right as they crossed the star line. As for other countries that I worked with, while we were in Germany, we didn't fight the Germans very often. We would train with them and there were a couple of units that would come out in the field with us. It was rare that we would actually fight them. When they would come to our training facility, they would bring 2 units and fight each other typically. Since they had to pay the US to train at our facility to include all our fuel, ammo, and such, they realized they could better spend their money by training 2 of their units at the same time by fighting each other. When Kosovo was going on, we did run a German unit that was deployed through the process and they were shocked that they got wiped out so quickly. I am talking quickly like we took an armored battalion in about 25 seconds from first contact to being combat ineffective. They then brought in their top armored battalion to fight us, and while they did a little better, they still didn't stand much of a chance. The Brits, we would work with once a year usually. It was expensive to bring them to Germany, so it wasn't very often. They were pretty good. I would rate them a little better than the US forces that were stationed in Germany, and likely on par with that of US stationed US forces. Probably the country that we would train the most was the Dutch army. They were a trip. You could really see where the difference is between an all-volunteer military and one that has conscripts. We would like to work with them as it was something different, and we would get a good laugh about things they would do. We'll never forget when I was the track commander as we were on an attack. Here is this Dutch truck coming down the road. It stops, backs up a couple of feet, and stops again. The next thing I see is all the occupants jumping out and running for their lives. They just left the truck in the middle of the road. Story 16. My great-uncle flew A6M0 Zeke fighter aircraft for the Japanese Imperial Navy. He survived one attack on an American carrier task force, but was wounded and relegated to light duty in China. He described the first time seeing the US fleet, circa 1944, as both awe-inspiring and extremely disheartening, simply the futility of trying to fight the US. Story 17. I actually played paintball against the US Marines once. It was scary stuff. They were in New Zealand as embassy guards and completely destroyed us during the attack. However, they couldn't play defend the flag very well.